My name is Sarah. I used to think it was whispered because it was precious, until I realized they were afraid to say it too loud. I always knew I was the quiet one, the one who sat in the corner during family dinners, picking at my food while my brothers told animated stories about their latest achievements, the one whose birthdays were half forgotten, celebrated with a store-bought cake and distracted smiles. My victories in school barely earned a nod from my parents, while my brother's mediocre report cards were celebrated like academic triumphs. My name was barely called unless it was to run an errand, to clean up after everyone else, to listen without interrupting while they discussed important family matters. My brothers were loud, golden, always in the spotlight. Jake played football and brought home trophies that lined our mantelpiece. Marcus had his music, filling the house with melodies that made our parents beam with pride. They wore their love for my brothers like medals, polished and displayed for everyone to see. For me, a polite silence, as if I were a guest who had overstayed her welcome in my own home. Before we continue, drop a comment. Where are you watching this from and what time is it there? I'd love to know how far this story is reaching, especially if you've ever felt like the invisible one in your own family. I learned early to make myself small, to walk softly down hallways, to speak only when spoken to celebrate my own achievements in the privacy of my bedroom. When I graduated valedictorian, my parents attended the ceremony, but spent most of it talking about Jake's upcoming game. When I got accepted to nursing school with a scholarship, the dinner conversation somehow shifted to Marcus's new girlfriend. I became an expert at swallowing my words, at finding pride in the spaces between their attention. But Grandpa was different. Harold Mitchell was my father's father, a man who had lived through war and loss with a quiet dignity that I recognized in myself. He had kind eyes that actually saw me, really saw me, in a way that made me feel less like a shadow and more like a person worthy of notice. When he came to visit, he would seek me out specifically, asking about my studies, my dreams, my thoughts on things that mattered. When Grandpa fell ill, everything changed. The house transformed into a stage, and suddenly, everyone was performing kindness. My brothers, who rarely visited before, were there every weekend, bustling around his bed, taking photos, recording videos of themselves feeding him soup or reading him the newspaper. They made sure every act of care was documented, every gesture of love captured for posterity. My parents orchestrated these performances, making sure the lighting was good, the angles flattering. I was there too, but in the background, as always. I was the one who changed his sheets at 3 a.m. when he had accidents. I massaged his swollen legs when the circulation got bad. I sat quietly beside his bed as he talked about the war, about the friends he'd lost, about the regrets that kept him awake at night. He told me about the orchard he never planted, the letters he never sent, the words he wished he'd said when there was still time. During those long, quiet hours together, something shifted between us. He would hold my hand with surprising strength, his weathered fingers intertwining with mine. "You're special, Sarah," he would whisper when no one else was around. "Don't let them convince you otherwise." Sometimes he would ask strange questions. If I had opened a savings account yet, if I knew how to read legal documents, if I understood the difference between a will and a trust. When he passed on a rainy Tuesday morning in October, I was the only one holding his hand. My brothers were at work. My parents were in the kitchen arguing about funeral arrangements. But I was there, watching the rise and fall of his chest grow slower and slower, until it stopped altogether. His last words were meant for me. "Remember what I told you about being special, little one. You'll understand soon enough." After the funeral, I noticed how they changed. The performance of grief was over, and now came something else. Something secretive and urgent. Whispers replaced the hugs they'd shared so publicly at the service. Doors closed more often. Conversations stopped abruptly when I entered rooms. My parents would exchange meaningful glances across the dinner table, the kind of looks that excluded me entirely. One evening, about a week after we buried Grandpa, I overheard my mother talking to my father in their bedroom. I had been bringing them tea, something I often did without being asked, when I heard her voice through the partially open door. "She doesn't need to know," my mother was saying, her voice tight with something I couldn't quite identify. "It would just complicate things. She's always been so emotional about everything. This is better handled quietly, between us and the boys." That was the first cut, sharp and clean, through whatever naive hope I'd been carrying, that my family's love for me was simply unexpressed, rather than absent entirely. The second cut came 2 days later, when I found the safe open in Grandpa's old study. Papers were scattered across his desk. Drawers had been rifled through with obvious haste. Legal documents I didn't recognize were stacked in neat piles, some highlighted in yellow, others marked with red pen. When I asked about it, my questions met empty eyes and forced smiles. "Nothing important," my father said, gathering the papers with unnecessary speed. "Just some old documents. You know how he was, sentimental about everything. We're just sorting through his effects." But I knew the scent of secrecy. I had been breathing it my entire life, that particular combination of averted gazes and changed subjects that accompanied every family decision made without my input. I knew what it felt like to be quietly erased from conversations, from decisions, from the very fabric of family life, and I felt, deeply and certainly, that something significant was being kept from me. My brothers were suddenly very busy. Jake took extra shifts at the construction company. Marcus picked up more gigs with his band, but I noticed they both had new things. Jake's truck got expensive modifications. Marcus bought equipment he'd been wanting for months. When I asked them about it, they gave me the same empty smile I'd gotten from our parents. Grandpa left. "Us a little something," Jake said, not meeting my eyes. "Just a small inheritance. Nothing major." But their definition of nothing major didn't match the relief I saw in my parents' faces, or the way my mother stopped checking the mailbox nervously every day, or how my father's shoulders seemed less burdened when he came home from work. Withdrew. Again. Like I had learned to do since childhood, I retreated into the spaces where I could exist without friction, without causing waves or asking uncomfortable questions. I busied myself with longer shifts at the hospital where I worked. As a nurse, taking on extra patients, volunteering for the overnight shifts that no one else wanted. I took longer walks home to avoid arriving at the house during dinner, when the weight of their shared secret would be heaviest at the table. But in that silence, in those long walks through the neighborhood where Grandpa and I used to stroll, together, I started remembering things. Small conversations that had seemed casual at the time, but now felt loaded with meaning. The way he held my hand tighter during his final weeks, as if he was trying to transfer something important through. Touch alone. The questions about legal documents, about my future plans, about whether I understood my own worth. I began to wonder, was I really invisible to him too? Or had he seen something in me that no one else did? Something that my family had spent years trying to convince me didn't exist? One sleepless night, I found myself Googling terms I'd never needed to understand before. Wills, trusts, probate law, estate planning. I used my breaks at the hospital to ask the legal volunteers who came, to help patients with advance directives. I started tracing Grandpa's connections, his old attorney, his friends from the war, the banker who had handled his accounts for decades. I did all of this quietly, methodically, the same way I'd learned to exist in my family. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. I didn't need the noise, the questions, the inevitable dismissal of my concerns as paranoia or jealousy. I simply needed to know the truth, whatever it might be. The breakthrough came on a Thursday evening in November. I had been working a double shift and I was exhausted, barely keeping my eyes open as I walked to my car in the hospital parking garage. My phone rang just as I was about to drive home. The number was unfamiliar, but something made me answer. "Is this Sarah Mitchell?" The voice was elderly, gentle, with the kind of warmth that reminded me immediately of Grandpa. "Yes," This is Sarah. My name is Henry Henley. I was your grandfather's attorney for many years. I hope you don't mind me calling you directly, but I've been trying to reach your family for weeks now, and I keep getting redirected or told that I should speak to your father or brothers instead. My heart started beating faster. What did you need to speak to them about? There was a pause, and then Mr. Henley chuckled softly. Funny thing is, I don't need to speak to them at all. Your grandfather was quite specific about who I should contact regarding certain matters. He was quite sure it should be you. The parking garage suddenly felt too small, too quiet. I gripped the phone tighter. What kind of matters? The kind that require a private conversation, not one conducted over the phone. Would you be available to meet with me tomorrow? I have some documents that your grandfather specifically requested I place directly in your hands. I met Mr. Henley at his office the next afternoon. It was a small, cluttered space that smelled of old books and coffee, with diplomas covering the walls and stacks of legal documents creating small mountains on every surface. He was exactly what I had imagined. Silver-haired, kind-eyed, with the sort of gentle presence that made you want to trust him immediately. Your grandfather spoke of you often, he said, as he poured me a cup of tea from a thermos. He was very proud of you, you know. Said you were the only one in the family who inherited his sense of justice. My throat tightened. He never told me that. Harold was a man who believed actions spoke louder than words, but he was very clear about his intentions regarding you. Mr. Henley moved to an old filing cabinet and withdrew a manila envelope, thick with documents. He came to see me 6 months before he passed away. Said he needed to make some changes to his will. Some very specific changes that he wanted to keep confidential until after his death. He handed me the envelope. My name was written on it in Grandpa's familiar handwriting, the letters slightly shaky but deliberate. Sarah Louise Mitchell, in blue ink, with "Confidential to be opened only by addressee" written underneath. I'm required to be present when you open this, Mr. Henley explained. Your grandfather's instructions were very specific about the process. My hands trembled as I opened the envelope. Inside was a single document, several pages long, with legal language that made my head spin. But as Mr. Henley guided me through it, translating the formal terms into plain English, the truth began to emerge like a photograph developing in dark water. It was an amendment to Grandpa's original will, dated 6 months before he passed away. The timing was significant. It was right around when he had started asking me those strange questions about legal documents and savings accounts. The amendment was simple and devastating. Everything that had been left to my children and grandchildren, to be divided equally, in the original will was now specified differently. The house, the savings account, the investment portfolio, even the 20 acres of farmland that Grandpa had always talked about turning into an orchard, all of it was now designated to my granddaughter Sarah Louise Mitchell, whom I trust will know what to do with this inheritance and will handle it with the wisdom and kindness she has always shown. There's more, Mr. Henley said gently, turning to the next page. He left specific instructions about how this information was to be handled. He suspected that your family might attempt to complicate matters. The next page contained a letter in Grandpa's handwriting, addressed to me personally. My dearest Sarah, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have finally learned the truth about what I've left behind. I know this will come as a shock, and I know your family will not understand. But I need you to know that this decision was not made lightly or in anger. It was made with love, and with complete confidence in the person you are. You were the only one who sat with me during my final months, not because you wanted something from me, but because you genuinely cared about an old man's stories. You were the only one who listened to my regrets without judgment, who helped me without expecting recognition, who showed me kindness without an audience to witness it. Your brothers are good men, but they are their parents' sons. They see the world in terms of what they can take from it. Your parents love you, I believe, but they have never understood your value because they measure worth in noise and ambition, not in compassion and integrity. I am giving you this inheritance not because I love you more than the others, but because I trust you more than the others. I trust you to use this gift wisely, to build something meaningful with it, to honor the values that we shared during our quiet conversations. Do not let them make you feel guilty for accepting what is rightfully yours. Do not let them convince you that you don't deserve this. You are the only one among them who ever saw me as more than just a source of potential inheritance. Be strong, little one. You are more special than they ever let you believe. I was crying before I finished reading. Mr. Henley handed me a box of tissues and waited patiently while I composed myself. The will has already been through probate, he explained. Your family engaged their own attorney to handle the estate, and that attorney has been working with the probate court for the past month. But he's been working with the old will, the one your grandfather replaced. I've been trying to contact your family to let them know about the amendment, but as I mentioned, they keep directing me to speak with your father or brothers. They don't know about this amendment. No. And legally, I'm not obligated to inform them until the probate process is complete. Your grandfather's instructions were that I should give you the opportunity to decide how you wanted to handle the revelation. I stared at the documents in my hands. The numbers were staggering. Grandpa had been far more financially comfortable than any of us had realized. The house alone was worth more than $500,000, and his investment portfolio had grown significantly over the years. The farmland, which sat just outside town in an area that was becoming increasingly valuable for development, was worth even more. What happens now? I asked. Now you have some choices to make. We can file the amendment with the probate court immediately, which will halt the current proceedings and redirect all assets to you as specified in the final will. Or, if you prefer, you can choose to honor parts of the original will, perhaps sharing some of the inheritance with your family members, though you would be under no legal obligation to do so. I left Mr. Henley's office with copies of all the documents and a head full of questions. I drove home slowly, taking the long way through the neighborhoods where Grandpa and I used to walk. I found myself stopping at the small park where we often sat on a bench and fed the ducks, where he would tell me stories about his childhood and ask me about my dreams for the future. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than sadness or confusion. I felt empowered. Not because of the money, though that was certainly life-changing, but because of what the inheritance represented. Grandpa had seen me. He had valued me. He had trusted me enough to entrust his entire life's work to my care. But I also felt a deep sadness for what this revelation meant about my family. They had spent the weeks since Grandpa's death dividing up what they thought was their inheritance, excluding me entirely from the process. They had made decisions about his possessions, his home, his legacy, without even consulting me, and they had lied to me about it, repeatedly and deliberately. That evening, I sat in my small apartment and looked at the documents spread across my kitchen table. I thought about Grandpa's letter, about his trust in my judgment, about his belief that I would know what to do. And slowly, a plan began to form in my mind. I didn't confront them immediately. Instead, I watched. I listened. I let them continue their planning, their discussions about renovating Grandpa's house before selling it, their debates about how to divide the proceeds from his investments. I heard Jake talking to Marcus about the down payment he was planning to make on a new house with his share of the inheritance. I heard my parents discussing their plans to use their portion to finally take the European vacation they'd been dreaming about for years. They were spending money that wasn't theirs, making plans based on lies they had told themselves about my irrelevance to Grandpa's life. And with each overheard conversation, each casual mention of our inheritance that excluded me entirely, my resolve grew stronger. I spent the next 2 weeks gathering additional documentation. I requested copies of all the probate filings from the court. I obtained records of Grandpa's financial accounts. I even drove out to visit his old friends, the ones he had mentioned in his stories, to better understand the man who had chosen to trust me with his legacy. Each conversation revealed new layers to my grandfather's character. Mrs. Patterson, his next-door neighbor for 30 years, told me how he had quietly paid for her grandson's medical treatments when the family couldn't afford them. Mr. Rodriguez, who owned the hardware store downtown, shared how Grandpa had anonymously donated money to help struggling families pay their bills during the recession. Coach Williams from the high school talked about the scholarship fund Grandpa had established for students who couldn't afford to play sports. He never wanted credit for any of it, Coach Williams told me. Said the best kind of generosity was the kind nobody knew about. He was a humble man, your grandfather. Saw a lot of pain in the world and tried to ease it quietly. These conversations helped me understand why Grandpa had chosen me. It wasn't just because I had been kind to him during his illness. It was because he recognized in me the same quiet generosity, the same tendency to help without seeking recognition, the same value system that had guided his own life. On a cold December morning, exactly 2 months after Grandpa's death, I called my family and asked them to meet me at his house. I told them I had something important to discuss about his estate. They assumed, I think, that I had finally accepted my exclusion from the inheritance and wanted to say goodbye to the house before they sold it. I arrived early and let myself in with the key that Grandpa had given me years ago, the one my family didn't know I had. I walked through the rooms slowly, remembering all the conversations we'd had in each space. The kitchen where he taught me to make his famous apple pie. The living room where we watched old movies together on Sunday afternoons. The study where he told me stories about the war and showed me his medal collection. When my family arrived, they found me sitting at Grandpa's dining room table with a manila folder in front of me. The same table where I had spent countless hours during my childhood, quietly listening to their conversations without being invited to participate. "Sarah, we're glad you called," my father said, taking his usual seat at the head of the table. "We've been meaning to talk to you about the house. We know this is difficult, but we need to start preparing it for sale." "Actually," I said, my voice calmer than I felt, "I asked you here because I have some information about Grandpa's will that I think you should know." My mother exchanged a look with my father. Jake shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Marcus was checking his phone, clearly wanting to be anywhere else. "Sweetie," my mother said in that patronizing tone I had heard my entire life. "We've already been through all of that with the lawyer. Everything's been sorted out." I opened the manila folder and removed the amended will. I placed it on the table in front of them. "Have you seen this document before?" My father leaned forward and picked up the papers. As he read, his face went through a series of changes: confusion, disbelief, and finally, something that looked like panic. "This can't be right," he said, his voice tight. "This is dated after Dad's original will, but our lawyer said, 'Your lawyer was working with the old will,'" I explained. "This is an amendment that Grandpa made 6 months before he died. It supersedes everything in the original document." Jake grabbed the papers from our father and scanned them quickly. His face flushed red as he reached the critical section. "This is impossible. Why would Grandpa leave everything to you? You barely spent any time with him." The lie was so blatant, so completely divorced from reality, that I almost laughed. I spent every weekend with him for the last 2 years of his life. I was there every time he was hospitalized. I was holding his hand when he died while you were all at work. "That's not," Marcus started, but his voice trailed off. Even he couldn't quite manage to argue with the truth. My mother was staring at the document like it was written in a foreign language. "Sarah, there must be some mistake. Your grandfather wouldn't have... this doesn't make sense." "It makes perfect sense to me," I said quietly. Grandpa left his estate to the person he trusted most. The person who cared for him without expecting anything in return. The person who listened to his stories and valued his wisdom. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see them processing the implications, calculating what this meant for their plans, their dreams, their assumptions about their own importance in Grandpa's life. "You can't do this," Jake said finally. "You can't just take everything. We're family." "Yes, we are family," I agreed. "Which makes it even more painful that you've spent the last 2 months lying to me about the inheritance, making plans that excluded me entirely, and treating me like I didn't matter to Grandpa at all." My father cleared his throat. "Sarah, I think there might be some misunderstanding here. We never meant to exclude you. We were just trying to handle things efficiently. By telling me that Grandpa left you a little something while you were actually dividing up his entire estate, by going through his personal belongings without me, by discussing renovations, to his house and plans for selling it without even consulting me, the shame didn't come with tears or dramatic apologies. It came with silence, with averted gazes, with the gradual recognition that their behavior had been indefensible. One by one, they began to retreat, not physically, but emotionally, pulling back from the confrontation they couldn't win. "What do you want from us?" my mother asked finally. "I want you to understand that Grandpa made this choice deliberately. He didn't do it to hurt you or to cause family drama. He did it because he trusted me to handle his legacy with the same care and wisdom that he had shown throughout his life." I stood up and walked to the window that looked out over Grandpa's backyard, where he had always planned to plant his orchard. "I want you to know that I intend to honor that trust. I'm going to plant the apple trees he always talked about. I'm going to continue the anonymous donations he made to help families in need. I'm going to use this inheritance the way he would have wanted, quietly, generously, without fanfare." When I turned back to face them, I saw something I had never seen before in their eyes when they looked at me. Respect. Not the grudging acknowledgement they might give to a stranger, but genuine respect for the person I had become despite their neglect. "I'm not doing this to punish you," I continued. "I'm doing this because Grandpa believed I was the right person for this responsibility. And for the first time in my life, I'm going to trust his judgment over your opinion of me." They left without arguing further. No dramatic exits, no slammed doors, just a quiet acknowledgement that the conversation was over and the situation was beyond their control. I stayed in the house as the afternoon light faded, sitting in Grandpa's favorite chair and looking out, at the yard where his orchard would grow. I thought about his letter, about his faith in my character, about the years of quiet conversations that had built the foundation of trust between us. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't feel like a guest in my own story. I felt like the protagonist of something meaningful, something that honored both my grandfather's legacy and my own worth. The legal proceedings took several more weeks to complete, but the outcome was never in doubt. Mr. Henley filed the amended will with the probate court, and the judge ruled that it was valid and superseded all previous versions. My family's attorney was professional about the situation, though I could tell he was embarrassed that he had missed such a significant document. My parents and brothers had to return the items they had already removed from Grandpa's house, though. I could see the effort this cost them. Jake had to cancel his plans for the new house. Marcus had to return the expensive equipment he had purchased. My parents had to abandon their European vacation dreams. But I felt no satisfaction in their disappointment. Instead, I felt a deep sadness for the relationships that had been damaged by their assumptions about my worthlessness and their casual cruelty in excluding me from family decisions. Over the following months, I began to transform not just Grandpa's property, but my own life. I quit my job at the hospital and used part of the inheritance to go back to school for my master's degree. I wanted to become a nurse practitioner, to have more autonomy in caring for patients, to build the kind of career that would have made Grandpa proud. I hired a landscaping company to help me plant the orchard, 20 apple trees of different varieties, arranged in neat rows across the back acre of the property. I stood in the kitchen window each morning and watched them grow, thinking about Grandpa's dreams taking root in the soil he had tended for so many years. I also began to understand more fully why Grandpa had trusted me with his charitable giving. I established a small foundation to continue his anonymous donations, focusing on families who were struggling with medical bills and children who needed help affording school activities. I kept detailed records but never publicized the donations. Like Grandpa, I believed the best generosity was the kind that happened in silence. My relationship with my family slowly began to heal, though it took time and honest conversations that were sometimes painful. They had to confront their own assumptions about worth and family dynamics. I had to learn to set boundaries and demand the respect I had always deserved. Jake was the first to apologize, genuinely and completely. He came to the house one evening, in spring, when the apple trees were beginning to bloom, and sat with me on the porch where Grandpa and I used to talk. "I was wrong about everything," he said simply. "Wrong about you, wrong about Grandpa, wrong about what family means. I spent so much time trying to be the golden child that I never learned to see the value in quiet strength." Marcus took longer to come around, but eventually he too recognized that his understanding of family relationships had been shallow and self-centered. My parents struggled the most with accepting the new dynamic, but they gradually began to treat me as an equal rather than as the family afterthought. The house became a gathering place again, but on different terms. When we had family dinners now, I was no longer the quiet one in the corner. I was the host, the one who set the tone, the one whose opinions mattered. It was a strange reversal that took getting used to, but it felt right in a way that our old dynamic never had. One year after Grandpa's death, I was standing in the orchard during apple blossom season when Mr. Henley came to visit. He was officially retiring and wanted to see how I was managing my inheritance. "Your grandfather would be proud," he said, looking at the neat rows of blooming trees. "He always said you understood the difference between wealth and worth." "I think I'm finally beginning to understand what he meant," I replied. "It's not about the money or the property. It's about having the resources to live according to your values." That's exactly what he hoped you would learn. As we walked back toward the house, Mr. Henley shared one final piece of information. "You know, your grandfather rewrote his will 3 times over the years. The first version divided everything equally among all his children and grandchildren. The second version left larger portions to your brothers because he thought they would need more financial help. But the final version, the one that left everything to you, was written after he spent a weekend in the hospital, and you were the only family member who visited him both days." "I didn't visit him because I expected anything from him," I said. "I visited him because I loved him." "I know. That's exactly why he knew you were the right choice." That evening, as I sat in Grandpa's study reading one of his favorite books, I found a small piece of paper tucked between the pages. It was a note in his handwriting, dated just a few weeks before he died. "Sarah, I hope you know that you were never invisible to me. You were the light that kept me hopeful during my darkest moments. Thank you for seeing me as more than just an old man with stories. Thank you for listening with your heart." I folded the note carefully and placed it in my jewelry box next to the few pieces of my grandmother's jewelry that Grandpa had specifically left for me. They were simple pieces: a string of pearls, a wedding ring, a small brooch shaped like a butterfly. But they represented something far more valuable than their monetary worth. They represented the love of people who had seen my true value when others looked right through me. 2 years later, I graduated with my master's degree and opened my own practice as a nurse practitioner, specializing in geriatric care. I worked with elderly patients who reminded me of Grandpa, listening to their stories, honoring their wisdom, ensuring that they felt seen and valued in their final years. My family relationships had stabilized into something healthier and more honest. We still gathered for holidays and birthdays, but the dynamic was fundamentally different. I was no longer the overlooked daughter, the forgotten sister. I was the matriarch of our small family, the one who had inherited not just Grandpa's financial assets, but his role as the family's moral center. Sometimes my brothers would bring their children to visit the orchard, and I would tell them stories about their great-grandfather, the way he had once told me stories about his own childhood. I made sure they knew about his quiet generosity, his humble wisdom, his belief that the most important victories were the ones nobody else witnessed. On quiet evenings, I would sit in the orchard and remember Grandpa's words about being special. For most of my life, I had interpreted special as meaning different in a way that made me less valuable, less worthy of attention and love. But I finally understood what he had meant. I was special because I had learned to find worth in silence, strength in gentleness, and wisdom in listening. I was special because I understood that the most meaningful relationships were built on genuine care rather than performance, on quiet consistency rather than dramatic gestures. I was special because I had inherited the best parts of his character, his compassion, his integrity, his ability to see the worth in people that others overlooked. The orchard flourished under my care, producing baskets of apples each fall that I shared with neighbors, donated to food banks, and turned into the pies that Grandpa had taught me to make. The trees grew strong and tall, their branches reaching toward the sky like a testament to dreams that had finally taken root. And in the center of it all, I grew too, from the invisible girl who had spent years apologizing for taking up space, into the confident woman who understood that she had been chosen, not overlooked, by the person whose opinion mattered most. They had hidden the documents from me, but I was the only one named where it truly counted, in the heart of a man who had recognized my worth when no one else bothered to look.